I'm Dr. Aisha Z. Court, and this is My Afro-Cuban Life, Episode 1, Raíces, or Roots. So welcome to this first episode of My Afro-Cuban Life, where I'm talking about raíces, or roots. And in particular, I'm focused on my mom's side of the family, which is the Cuban side. I will talk about my dad's side of the family in later episodes, and probably even in this episode. But I wanted to start with my mom's side of the family because we have more records on my mom's side of the family as opposed to my dad's side. So on my mom's side, we have records that go back 5 generations. So we can trace back to my great grandparents, and then it gets kind of murky. And I was wondering why it got kind of murky, and then I remembered, slavery, which kind of messed up everybody's records. We've gone back, done the Ancestry.com stuff, and looked at things like that. But for me, I have, like, in my own personal possession, I have documents from my mom when she came to the States in the 60s, from my grandmother when she came in the 50s, my great-grandmother, I have her passports when she came from Jamaica to Cuba. And I don't have my great-great-grandmother's passports, but we have a lot of photos, and they came from Panamá to Jamaica, and then Jamaica to Cuba. So we have all these different threads coming together to create this Afro-Cuban world. So the other interesting thing about my family, like, we have all these weird connections, maybe not weird, we have interesting connections to water, and also patterns that repeat themselves. So I am the only daughter of an only daughter who is an only daughter of an only daughter. So soy la única hija de Juana, que era mi mamá, que era la única hija de Carmela, que era mi abuela, que era la única hija de Cristina, que era mi bisabuela, que era la única hija de Enamora, que era mi tatabuela. So 5 generations of only daughters. And there's something in there, like short story maybe, I don't know. But I thought that was always really interesting when I looked back and looked at the family tree, that there were only daughters of only daughters of only daughters and only daughters. Anyways, so for us, if we start with Endamora, I know that my great-grandmother was born in 1908 because I have her passport. And here's a picture. So my great-grandmother, Endamora. Endamora, what we know is that she came from Panama to Jamaica in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Here's a photo of my great-grandmother with my grandmother, and this is in 1930. Yeah, so that's my great-grandmother, my grandmother. And it's interesting, my grandmother was raised by my great-grandmother. She didn't go back to her mom until she was in her teens, and I think she had her life. But my great-grandmother and my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather by trade were bakers, which is interesting because you look at my great-grandmother's passport and her profession is cook. So she also by trade was a cook, baker. So they had a bakery. Her and my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, Cristina, also had a bakery with my great-grandfather, Stanley, who is my grandmother's father. There we go. So we get from Panama to Jamaica. My great-grandmother, Cristina, was born in, I want to say, 1908. Yes, 1908. Actually, look at her passport. Hold on a second. Yep, born in 1908. So, she's a Libra. I just saw that, like me. But she was born in 1908 in Jamaica. And then at some point they moved from Jamaica. She ends up in Cuba. One of the things that, if you take a look at Caribbean history and why people have all these different last names and family members over here on this island versus that island, especially that Panama to Jamaica jump, is because of circulatory migration. Many people, beginning of the 20th century, you're moving for work. and work goes with the season. So people will move from island to island to island, whether it's the cane season in one place, the rice season somewhere else. So you do have a lot of families that have similar trails. Some roots in Jamaica, some roots in Cuba, some roots in Panama. Especially when you talk to Cubans on the east side of the island, a lot of them will say like, oh, we have family in Jamaica. Or people in Jamaica will say, oh, my grandfather was from Cuba. And that's a common conversation. There's also a lot of Haitians in Cuba that people don't talk about because Haiti and Cuba are this close. So we have Tumba Frances is what they call it in Cuba. So these little enclaves of Haitian descendants that are in Cuba throughout the island. So Tumba Frances. But anyways, I digress. I'm going off track. So Cristina comes from Jamaica to Cuba. My grandmother is born in Cuba in 1925. This is where it gets a little bit sketchy. I don't know all the years. I think my grandmother went to Jamaica when she was about 5 or 6, and she stayed with my great-great-grandmother. So she did her primary schooling in Jamaica before coming back to Cuba, and she had my mother in Cuba in 1945. So that's the trajectory. And the Mora in Panama comes to Jamaica, has my great-grandmother Cristina in 1908. Cristina goes to Cuba, and in Cuba she has my grandmother Carmela in 1925. My grandmother leaves Cuba at a young age to do her schooling, her primary schooling, which is like the first grade, in Jamaica, and then comes back to Cuba. She's in Cuba. Oh, my grandmother was working as a cook and a seamstress. She did a lot of things, and before she left Cuba, she was working as a translator for a U.S. military person, but that's a whole other story. We'll talk about that later. And then she has my mom in 1945. So that's where we're at with trajectory. One of the interesting things that I find about families that have these many different layers, many different I guess strands of the web that spin out is language. So in my family, starting with me, I think, yeah, one of my only cousins of that group that was raised speaking Spanish. When my grandmother came to came to the U.S., she came to Florida and then went to Boston because we had an aunt here and she was working in Boston. When my mom and my uncle came in the 60s, my mom spoke Spanish, my uncle spoke Spanish, but they went Florida because they were Operation Peter Pan, which is another episode. There's a lot of layers to this. And then they ended up in Boston. My grandmother came and got them. And in Boston, my mom kept speaking Spanish, but my uncle, because he was a lot younger, he asked my mother not to speak to him in Spanish in front of his friends because he was getting made fun of and it was just harder. So now my uncle, who came from Cuba, doesn't speak Spanish anymore. My other two uncles, by the time they were born, my grandmother was living in Georgia. And their dad, who was Jamaican with Cuban roots, another like back and forth story, made the very deliberate choice that they would not speak Spanish because it would be easier for them to just be black. And this is in the 1960s and 70s in Georgia. So they don't speak Spanish. Now, going back, in Cuba, when my grandmother was in Cuba, in Oriente with my mom, they lived in a neighborhood where there's a lot of circulatory migration. So you have people who come from families who have a history of speaking English and Spanish. So that wasn't a big deal. They spoke both. But when my grandmother was living in Jamaica, she was not allowed to speak Spanish in the house. She had to speak English. So that is an interesting story, even though my great-great-grandparents, being in Panama, they spoke English and Spanish, but in the house, when they moved to Jamaica, they didn't allow Spanish to be spoken in the house, just English, as they felt that my grandmother needed to work on her English. And now you hear people from the part of the island that we're from, in Cuba and Oriente and Banes, and they speak English with a Jamaican accent or a West Indian accent. So people never knew where to place our family if they heard them speaking in English, because you sound like you're Jamaican or one of those, an island close around, and that's because of that trajectory of Panama to Jamaica to Cuba. Now, go back to my cousins, my generation, my first cousins, and even their kids. Now you see a resurgence of people wanting to speak Spanish, the younger kids taking Spanish in school, wanting to learn more about their heritage and their background, which I think is really cool. So that's really encouraging to see. I don't have kids yet, but if I should have kids, I would teach them Spanish, just so that they know, and it's part of their heritage. It's not so much that it has to be a Spanish-speaking household, but they should be able to go back and forth. And I'm really glad that my mom did teach me Spanish, so I have that background and that ability to move between at least those two languages. Now my dad, he speaks multiple languages because he's just like a crazy polyglot, super smart. He speaks English. He's from Guyana, which is a British colony, so he speaks English. He was a language major, but his doctorate is in sociology and economics, one of those. But he speaks Spanish and French and Hebrew, and I think Greek is another one that he has. And my little brother, like, we're just a language family. He went to a Mandarin immersion high school, so we're all languaged out. Another cool way that roots really come up is in the foods that we eat. Cuban food it already has a strong African influence, so you see the vestiges of Yoruban culture with the way that we prepare plátano, the okra quimbombo, that's what we call that. But you see the other West Indian influences, especially Jamaican side and the Panamanian side, when you make bakes, when you have ackee and saltfish, or bacalao, as they call it in Spanish, plátano maduro, fufu, mofongo, these ajiacos, these stews, these big elaborate stews that you see in both countries, dumplings in the morning versus afternoon, avena, or just oatmeal. These foods that have different names in different places, but we're eating the same foods because we're coming from the same roots. The boat is just stopping in different places. That's always been really interesting to me. Looking at the foods, like the way a curry is prepared in Eastern Cuba versus in Jamaica, they're very similar, versus a Guyanese curry, which is more similar to Indian curry, because you have a stronger root there. But all of these things are connected. That's always been really interesting to me. So that's a little bit of my Afro-Cuban life. Thank you for joining me for the first episode, talking about Raíces. You've learned a little bit about my familiar maternal line, and I hope that you guys come back for the next episode. Ciao.